Hi, I'm Andy. I'm building a Cedar Strip Canoe in this series of videos. This episode, I'm afraid, is a bit of a continuation of the first episode, which was lovingly known as Andy Makes Planks. The reason for that is I have to rip down the planks I made in episode 1 into thin strips, which can be used to build up the hull of the canoe. By the end of this episode though, I do fit the first strips onto the mould, which is a massive step towards actually making the canoe. It's a multi-fold process to create the strips. The first is that I have to take the planks that I made in episode 1 and put them through the thickness planer to bring them down to the finished 3/4 inch thickness. Those planks are then further ripped down into thin strips of about 1/4 inch thickness on the bandsaw. It's a pretty common problem to spend 3 hours building a jig to save 20 minutes of work. I've just made a fingerboard and it's absolutely not in this category. It's a game changer. It pushes the piece of wood you're cutting against the fence and stops it coming back as well. It just holds it in place nicely. I can cut faster and I can cut much more accurately. Finished the huge job of cutting down my single piece of cedar into 120 or so thin strips, each one about 8mm by 20mm. They're stored in a rack to keep them in the exact order that they came out of the piece of cedar. That's important to allow me to colour match individual strips, as the piece of cedar changed colour quite significantly through its thickness and width. The next step was to pass each of these strips through the thickness planer just to take off the irregularities in the cuts that the cheap bandsaw puts on them. In order to apply the bead and cove finish on these strips I've made, I've set up a simple homemade router table. Now I have just looked up the pronunciation. It is router, from the obsolete verb to route, which means to dig out or remove. So I'm not just being American when I say router. I had to be sure of that. Every single one of the strips now has a bead and cove applied. The bead is a round over on one side, and the cove is the negative of that, the concave surface on the opposing side. The purpose of that is that when you join these planks together around the hull of the canoe, they have a lot of good surface contact for glue, and also they can conform to the shape of the hull, no matter what shape that is at any point. I'm ready to start fitting them onto the mould to make the hull. The first step in that process then is to reattach the stems that I made in the last video, and then shape them to accept the strips. Shaped enough for the first 5 planks or so to go on here, plus a bit of margin so I don't come up to the top of the bit of shape. What are you doing? So this is the big moment. I'm going to fit the first plank to either side of the hull. I'll probably put 1 or 2 more above them for support, and that will be me for this week. First plank is on either side of the boat. I've checked from pretty much every direction and they appear to be fair, a nice smooth curve from stem to stem. The staples are temporary, they'll be taken out once the hull is complete, and once they're fiberglass it should be difficult to see the holes left behind. I've put the second plank on the first side, and I'm not very happy with how the staples are going in. So in one case I've actually missed very slightly with the staple, and I've put it through the edge of the plank, which I'll need to remove and replace. But equally the staples, even in other places, are leaving pretty bad holes and actually blowing out the back of the strips in some places. I think that will leave quite obvious marks on the inside of the canoe. So I'm going to stop, and I'm going to change to the stapleless method, which is described in the book. It's apparently a bit harder work, but and takes a bit longer, but leaves a much nicer finish, and also is going to avoid these problems I seem to be having with my stapler. However, that's it for this episode. I'm really pleased to have got the first few planks on, and in the next episode I'll move to the staple-free system and hopefully get a lot more of the hull put together. If you've enjoyed watching though, please do subscribe and click on the bell to get the notifications when my next video is out. Please click the thumbs up and leave any comments below as always. Bye just now.